Good morning to everyone. Welcome to Pavia University and to the course of Agroecology and Biodiversity Conservation of our faculty in Sustainable Agri-food. Agri-food sustainability, we call it. And today we start with a course in agroecology and biodiversity conservation. I am the responsible of this course. My name is Professor Graziano Rossi. I am a botanist and a plant ecologist. And thinking to this course, I was interested to agroecology. And so I thought the best way is to import a real agroecology. And he is Professor Miguel Altieri, one of the most representative of this discipline, which was very important, I think, in order to have a better management of agriculture in our time. Why agroecology in an agronomy course, but also why agronomy for ecologists? This is the main question. I think that we need to join the different knowledge in different subjects, in different research activities in order to be able to survive, really have the opportunity to go on with food production going on, but with many difficulties. We have seen the problem of wheat from Ukraine, for example, in this period, but food production is a general problem for humanity. Probably the main question is climate change effect. And so I think it is time now in order to have a better attention to nature and the rules of nature, and use them in order to have a more sustainable production for the future. Miguel Altieri, thank you, Miguel, for coming here. It is the second time Miguel is in Pavia. He was here also in 2015, the year of Expo in Milan, where we had an international Congress here in Pavia, and I asked him to come, and it was the first time I had this opportunity to be in contact with an agroecologist. And in this year, I thought many times about what you said in this Congress, and it was important for me were different items. For example, a different way to be in contact with agronomy and production, with more attention to agro ecosystems, soil, plants, interaction with insects, and so on. And they use the importance of agrobiodiversity. We are here experts in land races, for example, conservation, seed conservation, and seed bank. But normally we have not a big attention to our biodiversity. We lost a lot, more than 70% in the last 100 years in Europe. And another question is about the experience of all the farmers. In our activities, we collect seeds, going to speak with people. We had interview to all farmers, and one of the things we are looking for is the ancient way of cultivation, because cultivation in the past was really different. For example, sometimes I say my father, he is 95 years old, and he was born as a farmer. He told me about the cultivation of corn mixed with beans. Beans, corns, and also sometimes pumpkins, the three sisters. Then I had this information from you in 2015, but my father, when he was a boy and a farmer in the hills of Romagna, he had this cultivation. No one now is has a cultivation of a mix of corn and beans at the same time in the same place, for example. So maybe possible, I think, to have a good teaching from the past, but looking for the future. Then which is the messages can we have from agroecology? This is the main question I asked to Miguel. He has a week in order to replay, not only today, but today we have a general introduction to agroecology, and not only for you that you are the student of agri-food sustainability, but an open lesson to other students in Pavia, also to the student which will be here next year for the first time, and also to people, local people, because this item of agroecology is, I think, important also for our farmers, also in Lombardy, in Pavia, because we have to fight a lot against, for example, droughtness. Our farmers don't know how to continue to cultivate, for example, rice without water. It is a problem. Namaste, JP from India. We are saying about rice cultivation, which is increases because we haven't water. It is not raining now. So I think we are speaking of things very important for all of you, coming from many countries, not only Italy. And I think we have a very important opportunity with this teaching. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Professor Graziano Rossi. It is a pleasure to be back here in Pavia after 2015. I was invited to be here with you guys for about a week to talk about agroecology and biodiversity. I came with my colleague and wife, Clara Nichols, Professor Essa at Berkeley also, who also will be joining us in a couple of lessons during the week. So you get 2 per 1, okay?
Good.
So I'm going to delay the introduction of the students because we would like to know who you are, what is your background, but we'll delay it for later because now we have kind of a general YouTube presentation. But definitely I want to know who you are and what's your background and why are you studying this field? Why do you think it's important to study agri-food sustainable systems or sustainable agri-food systems? So what I'm going to do, well, a little bit about my background. I'm from Chile originally, and I did a master's and PhD in entomology. So the way I came to agroecology was through insects because when I joined the faculty in the University of California, Berkeley in 1981, I was there 38 years as professor. Now I'm Professor Emeritus. That means retired but still active. We were looking for alternatives to pesticides. One of the main, entomologists, especially with a book of Rachel Carson called The Silent Spring, there was an alarm about the use of pesticides and the impact on the environment. So entomologists were looking for alternatives. And Clara also is an entomologist. And we quickly understood that the problem were not the insects. The problem was the way we farm. The way we farm promotes conditions for pests to build up. And so what we needed to do is to kind of redesign the farms in order for them to be not susceptible to pests and to provide the conditions for beneficial biodiversity, insects that eat the insects, to promote processes called biological control. And so that's kind of my background. Maybe Clara wants to introduce herself.
Okay, my name is Clara Nichols. I'm from Colombia. I'm also an agronomist, an entomologist, and I work at UC Berkeley as a professor of agroecology and rural development for international students, but also for students from different backgrounds, political economy, development studies, environmental studies. So it's an upper division class. And we have been working in agroecology for more than 28 years. So the idea is to show how we have been working agroecology with the small farmers, but also with big farmers in California. And thank you for inviting Miguel, because allow me to come to Italy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna, okay, so before we get into the subject of agroecology, what is it? I think it's important to understand the context under which agriculture is operating today. And that's why I call it agroecology in a planet in polycrisis, because we don't only have one crisis, we have several crises that are affecting humanity right now. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, the armed conflict right now with Russia and Ukraine, economic crisis and inflation, food crisis, etc. So what is interesting about this polycrisis is that they are all connected, as you can see in this very complex diagram. You have Omicron, and you have the climate crisis, hunger crisis, but they're all interacting. So one of the key things is that these problems are all interrelated and interconnected, and you cannot understand them in isolation. They have to be connected and understood from what we call a systemic view, or holistic view. So for example, the causes what cause the pandemics are the same causes that cause climate change and biodiversity loss. And the pandemics induced a health crisis, but this health crisis triggered an economic crisis. But climate change was also affecting all of them at the same time and accelerating some of the problems. So when one problem gets aggravated, other problems also get aggravated. So at this moment, I think in humanity, we are at a time of ecological and economic rupture. We're in a process where things are trying to accommodate again, including the big economic powers right now are at a big struggle about who is going to dominate, China, Russia, United States, etc. And many of the problems that we're facing are just a manifestation of a cascade of catastrophes that could affect humanity if we continue the way we are, business as usual. If you look at the latest report of IPCC, which is the panel on climate change, it predicts that if policies continue the way they are right now, we're going to reach 3 degrees centigrade change, okay? And we should be at 1.5. But what is interesting is that industrial agriculture is also part of this cascade, because agriculture is the biggest activity that affects the biosphere, okay? So what we have right now, 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture, of which 80% is these huge monocultures that have advanced at the expense of wild ecosystems, deforestation, biodiversity loss, etc., etc. And you can see that these systems lack ecological and genetic diversity. and they are systems that are highly susceptible and vulnerable to pests and to climate change. So for example, we could be eating more than 250,000 species of plants, but it turns out that there are 3 species in the world, which is wheat, rice, and corn, that provide 50% of the calories that we eat. Okay, how come humanity is dependent only of 3 crops or 9 crops at the most, when we could be eating 250,000 species? What happens is there has been economic forces that have basically diminished our dietary diversity, and we have been basically condemned to eat 3 crops in different types of products, because corn is all over the place. It's not just the grain. It's in the pasta, it's in the bread, it's in the tortillas, it's in the sugar, it's everywhere. And here you can see on the left how the most planted crops in the world are wheat, maize, and rice, as you can see there. Soybean follows, then beans, and then the most revenue comes from cannabis. Okay, this one down here. But the revenue is not very high in corn, wheat, except the rice. But the most income-generating crop is cannabis. So, agriculture is nothing else but the artificialization of nature, the transformation of nature. What we do is we go and we cut a forest, a natural forest, a mature forest, and then as we transform it into a monoculture, like a paddy rice or a cornfield or a wheat field, whatever, you can see that the biodiversity goes down completely. There's a big decline in biodiversity. As the biodiversity declines, you can see that the need for external inputs increases. When you're in nature, you don't need to irrigate, you don't need to fertilize, you don't need to control the pests. Why? Because there's biodiversity components that are interacting, and through the interactions, they regulate the processes, the nutrient cycling, the biotic regulation, population regulation, etc. You don't need anything because it's a self-organized system in which actually the interactions between the components sponsor the function of the ecosystem. When you take out all the biodiversity, what we call the functional biodiversity, the biodiversity that plays ecological roles, and I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, you can see that the systems lack self-regulation, and they require inputs from the outside, pesticides and fertilizers. So in agroecology, what we're looking for are systems that have high levels of biodiversity, agricultural systems, and low to medium input levels, management intensity. So we can cut, the inputs from modern systems to about half or maybe less when you manage with agroecological principles. So when we start reducing the diversity of the landscape, then we can see that there's increased vulnerability to pests, that there's increased vulnerability to climate change, and there's also loss of ecosystem services. That means, for example, when you have monocultures and you apply nicotinoid insecticides, you kill all the pollinators, you lose the ecological service of pollination. You also kill beneficial insects that control other pests, so you lose the service of biological control, and so on and so on. So one example is that when you have these monocultures that are genetically homogeneous, like, for example, I don't know if you heard about the hunger that suffered in Ireland back in the 1800s, because there was one variety of potato that was highly susceptible to a disease, and it wiped it out, and a lot of people died, and a lot of people migrated from Ireland. This has repeated. This story has repeated many times here in the United States. In 1970, there was a huge loss of corn production to a disease because of one variety was dominating the landscape. And because of that, because these monocultures lack self-regulation, we need to apply pesticides constantly. Think about this. We're injecting into the biosphere 5.2 billion pounds of pesticides. That's about 2.5 billion kilos of pesticides injected into the biosphere every year, okay? And you can see that, the European Union, for example, the green one, is using a lot of pesticides despite the fact that you have a lot of environmental regulations here. Actually, up to 2012, pesticide use was going up in Europe. Now I know that there is a desire by 2030 to cut, 50 to 30% the use of pesticides. But it's not easy to get out of what we call the pesticide treadmill because of several reasons that we can discuss later. And pesticides, what is interesting to know, especially when you apply in airplanes, in big systems, or with tractors, only 1% of the pesticide reaches the pest. So 99% of the chemical goes into the environment, into the soil, into water. They get into the human food chains and so on. In the United States, if we calculated the impact of pesticides on the environment and on the health of people, it's about $10 billion a year. Human pesticide poisonings, 26 million people annually, especially in developing countries, because we export from Europe and the United States all the pesticides that we don't allow to use here, and then the people down there use them without protection. And so there's a lot of poisoning. And look at the impact on agrobiodiversity. Just the loss of natural pest control is $100 billion. The loss of soil fertility because it affects the soil biota, $25 billion. And the loss of yields because of lack of pollination, $15 billion. This is the extent of the impact that agriculture can have on ecosystem services. And the other thing that happens is that these insects and diseases and weeds are becoming resistant. So it's like with antibiotics. You use a lot of antibiotics, you become resistant. The antibiotic becomes resistant, it doesn't work anymore on you. Same thing, we have 500 species of insects that are resistant to more 1,000 pesticides. So the chemical strategy has failed, obviously. It's just that we keep putting more pesticides and new pesticides, but the treadmill continues. Well, we were also affected by COVID not too long ago, and we're still affected, actually. And COVID really revealed the fragility of the industrial system of food production. It made us realize how close intertwined is ecological, soil, plant, animal, and human health. They're all connected. And we saw the effects of the pandemic on food supply chains, on widespread food shortages and price spikes, diet changes, migrant workers' welfare, school children access to lunches, small farmers' viability. For example, in Latin America, more than 10 million children depend on the school lunches as the main lunch. And the schools were closed for more than a year. So those children, where did they get any food? But it is interesting that there is a connection between the way we farm, especially how we raise animals in industrial ways, and these pandemics. For example, by growing these animals confined, they're all genetically homogeneous, fosters conditions for new pathogens, and that's where the avian flu and many other diseases have emerged. They are called zoonotic diseases. So it is important to understand. I have a picture here. I'm sorry. For example, in South America, soybean, especially in Brazil, Argentina, is expanding at a very, very high rate, 57 million hectares. It's not because the Brazilian people and the Argentinian people eat the soybean. It's all to feed the cattle here in Europe and the cattle in China, okay? It's not for the people of South America. As these monocultures advance, what starts happening is that we cause deforestation. In the forest, there are many wildlife species, birds and armadillos and bats and so on, that coexist with thousands of viruses. So when we destroy their habitat, then there's a release of this wildlife, and they come in contact with cattle and with humans. And that's the basis for zoonotic diseases. So basically, it is estimated that there's more than 1.7 million undiscovered viruses that exist in mammalian and avian hosts in the natural ecosystems, of which 600,000 to 800,000 have the ability to infect humans. So if we continue, destroying the environment, advancing monocultures, we are going to be creating more conditions for pandemics. So we might be able to, hope not, but we could be facing COVID-20, COVID-21. Who knows if conditions continue. On top of that, we have the crisis in Ukraine and Russia, and what people didn't realize was the importance, especially of Russia, not so much of Ukraine, in producing fertilizers. So the prices of fertilizers started going up dramatically, and now, I don't know here in Italy, but in the United States, fertilizer costs went 160% up. So your cost of production are going to be very high. And many farmers are looking for alternatives. These are industrial farmers in Peru, for example, looking for alternative, organic amendments they are not available in the quantity that is required. And then also they didn't calculate the importance of Russia and Ukraine, but especially Russia, on wheat production. These are countries in Africa that are highly dependent on the imports from Russia. So you can see, look at, for example, Mozambique or Burkina Faso or Madagascar. They're totally rely on imports of wheat. And this is why today we're seeing that the price of food, especially wheat, is going up. And that is affecting the economic situation of many, many people and increasing food insecurity worldwide. And the next crisis, on top of everything, perhaps the most important one that determines the dynamics of the other crises, is climate change. We are supposed to be around 350 parts per million of CO2. We're already at 430. And this carbon dioxide increasing starts affecting the climate. For example, ocean warming, global sea level rise, warmer temperatures, more erratic rainfalls, et cetera. And because of that, it is estimated that by the year 2030, there could be more than 70 million ecological refugees, climatic refugees, people live in their countries not because they want to, because the conditions are not optimal anymore they're very marginal for food production. And most of these people that are living in those countries are coming from countries that didn't have anything to do with climate change. Because if you look at, I don't know, where are you from?
Iran.
Huh? Iran. Iran probably produces 0.025% of the global greenhouses. So if Iran tomorrow goes, zero, carbon neutral, it won't have an impact on what's happening at the world. The same thing would be, what country are you from? Nepal. Even less. Okay? And these countries that didn't contribute to climate change, because the big countries that contributed to climate change historically were United States, Europe, then China, then India, later, much later. They are the countries that cause climate change, and these are the recipients of climate change. So the recipients of climate change are migrating, okay? And this is going to cause, can you imagine if right now the countries in Europe are so worried about migration, what's going to happen when we have 70 million people that are going to be wanting to go somewhere? Okay, so we're experiencing drought not only here in Italy, in northern Italy. For example, in the United States, in March of last year, more than 35% of the area under corn in the Midwest suffered droughts that had never happened in 50 years. In California, for example, where we come from, last year was the driest year in 100 years, last year. That was 22, in September 22. This year, the most rainy year in 100 years. Just in 6 months, whoosh, the thing changed dramatically, okay? So these farmers lost more than 35% of their corn. Their corn is mostly transgenic corn. And in California, the farmers had to abandon more than 500,000 acres, about 250,000 hectares, because there's no water. So they're abandoning the land, or they're putting solar panels in the fields. And Caribbean countries, more tropical countries, are suffering the effects of hurricanes. For example, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, all those countries. So it is estimated that if you see this red line, as the temperature goes up above 1.5, the effects on yields is going to be dramatic. This is mostly in industrial systems. You can see that maize and wheat and rice yields are basically expected to decline dramatically if you go above 2 degrees. So it is estimated by the year 2050 there could be a global decline of yields of 16%, and the prices of food could go up to 150%. So it is interesting that with all the advancements of science and with all the technology that we have developed an agriculture that is not sustainable. Why do we have a laurea in agri-food sustainability if agriculture was not sustainable, And we have an agriculture that degrades the soil, leaches chemicals into the environment, is susceptible to weeds, pathogens, and insects, and we have to spray chemicals, is vulnerable to climate change, depends on fossil fuels that are becoming more and more expensive, and creates conditions for the emergence of pandemics. So we need to change this agriculture. There has to be a transition to a more sustainable, equitable agriculture. And I wanted to leave you with an important fact that most people don't know this. Industrial agriculture, I'm talking about the big industrial monocultures, occupies 80% of the land, 70% of the water, uses 70% of the water for irrigation, and uses 80% of the fossil fuels, but produces only 30% of the food we eat. Most of the agriculture is for production of biomass, for fodder for animals, or biomass for biofuels, okay? So, thank you, Professore. That's nice. Un po' de pasta, no? So, what we say in agroecologists, although not everybody's in agreement with this, because in agriculture there's many fields, and there are people that still believe that industrial agriculture is the way, and only we have to kind of change a little thing, the genetics and so on and so on. And production needs to increase sustainably. But it's a myth when you hear, that they say we need to double food production in order to feed the world by the year 2050, because right now, how many people are starving in the world? 1 billion people. And we have enough food to feed 9 billion people. So hunger, at this point, doesn't have much to do with food production. It has to do with lack of access to food, poor people, lack of access to land to produce the food, okay? So we need to increase agriculture production sustainably, but we're going to have less arable land. We're going to have less petroleum or more expensive petroleum. We're going to have less water for sure, and within a scenario of climate change. So what we say is that this challenge cannot be met with the existing industrial agriculture technologies and its biotechnological derivations. We need a new paradigm. Do you remember who was Einstein? He was here, I understand. He said, you cannot solve a problem with the same mentality that created it. That means we cannot solve the crisis that we're facing today with the same mentality that created that crisis. What is the mentality? Capitalism. Okay? So if you think that the tools to solve the crisis that was created by capitalism and industrialization is going to come from the industry, I think that you need to think again. We need to come up with new ideas, new paradigms that are going to allow us to meet the challenges of the future, which are all interrelated and systemic. So what we need to do is to move agriculture, transition from this agriculture that is highly dependent, doesn't have agrobiodiversity, that is highly dependent on pesticides and fertilizers, and is degrading of the environment. And we need to move it to an agriculture that is more sustainable, that is more resilient, and that is more information intensive rather than input intensive. Because here, in this paradigm of industrial agriculture, all you need to do is some recipes. Okay, you need to apply so much nitrogen, you need to apply so much pesticides, so much water, okay, that's it. Here, when you create diverse systems with many species interacting, you need to know a lot about ecology. You need to know a lot about agronomy, about entomology, about plant pathology, about soils, etc. Because you're dealing with a very complex system, okay? So, for us, a sustainable agricultural system is a system that is socially just. That means that food is a human right, that everybody has to have access to it, that is environmentally sustainable, doesn't degrade or destroy nature, promotes local economies, it promotes the health of people. There's a connection between what we eat, the quality of our food, and our health, and that is culturally appropriate also, okay? So that's our definition of sustainability. And the agriculture of the future, what we need for the future, is an agriculture that has to be decoupled from fossil fuel dependence. It cannot be dependent on non-renewable resources that are going to become more scarce and more expensive. We need to create agricultural systems that have low environmental impact, that don't destroy nature. And this doesn't mean that you have to use less pesticides, because, you know, what is the difference between 1 part per million and 1 part per billion in terms of, you know, impacts on microorganisms in the soil, for example? It has to be resilient to climate change. It has to be an agriculture that is multifunctional, not only produces food, which is important, obviously, but also maintains the cultures, maintains the knowledge, maintains the biodiversity. Okay, so it has social services, ecological services, and it has to be the foundation of local food systems. Because by the year 2030, there's going to be many more people in the world, and the cities, 80% of humanity is going to live in cities, not in the countryside. And the cities of more than 10 million people are going to triple in numbers in the world. You know how much food has to be imported into a city of 10 million people? Take a guess. How much food has a city like Rome? I don't know if Rome has 10 million people or more. How much food has to enter that city every day? Take a guess. 1,000 tons? 6,000 tons a day, which travels in average 1,000 kilometers. Because today when you ate and you look at your food, the food didn't come from Pavia. The food came, maybe your orange came from southern Spain. Your meat came from Argentina, a professor was telling me at lunch. So 1,000 miles on average is called the food miles, okay? So that's totally unsustainable. You know, we cannot have this global food system with climate change, with the emissions, with the energy expenses. There's no way. We need to change, and we have to create local food systems. So what we're looking for is an agriculture that is highly diverse, has a lot of diversity, biological, ecological diversity, agrobiodiversity, and productivity, highly productive, but in an efficient way. How do you get efficiency in modern agriculture? Is by, first of all, enhancing the diversity of enterprises, where you have crops and cattle and trees all mixed together in different designs. Then you have high recycling rates. So whatever is left over of the animals goes as, you know, to the crops. Whatever was left over from the crops goes back to the animals as food. You close the cycles, okay? And therefore you don't depend on external inputs. So that's the agriculture we're looking for. And this is where agroecology comes in. Agroecology is a science that integrates the knowledge that we learn in the university, you know, ecology and ecological economics and sociology, but also soils, plant pathology, entomology, etc., etc. But we also, especially people coming from developing countries, from Asia, Africa, Latin America, we take into consideration the knowledge of farmers that have been farming for thousands of years, generation after generation, okay? And why do you want to look at those systems? Because those systems still exist, and they stood the test of time. They've been there for thousands of years, still operating, and I'm going to show you some slides. So what agroecology does, it provides a bridge to create a dialogue of wisdoms, and from that emerges principles. And those principles take different technological forms depending on the social, economic conditions of each region. So for example, one principle of agroecology is diversity. Well, in a small-scale farmer in Nepal, it will take a form of mixture of different crops. In Italy, in Pavia rice fields, it's going to take a different form, okay? But the principle is the same, diversity there, diversity here. And these are the principles of agroecology. I gave you some readings, so I'm not going to go in detail. But there are 6 principles that if you follow them, they take the form of practices, and those practices then set in motion processes. So here's kind of the summary. You have the agroecological principles. The principles take the form of a practice, and the practice sets in motion a process. What we want to do is promote processes, ecological processes in agriculture, in order for that agriculture to be healthy. It's just like in our health. There are certain principles that we need to follow, and those take the form of practice. For example, you have to do exercise. That's a principle. You practice. You have to eat, reasonable food, vegetarian, organic, whatever. You need to practice meditation to be more calm, etc., etc. Okay, and that sets in motion processes like immunity, good digestion, good circulation, and so on and so on. The same thing in agriculture. So we take the principles. For example, cover cropping. Cover cropping is, let's say, in the vineyards here, in the fall, in October, you plant fava bean, Fabino, between the rows. My father was from Napoli, so parlo un po' di italiano, capisco un po'. Anyway, so you plant fava bean, which is a legume, and then you incorporate it into the soil in the spring. Why do you want to do that? Because you want to increase organic matter in the soil. Also, the roots of the fava bean fix nitrogen. Okay, so that's the practice. The principle is diversity, or the principle of recycling biomass, 2 principles, take the form of one practice, cover crop. Now, the cover crop, when you incorporate it, sets in motion processes like what? Recycling of nutrients, water conservation, activation of soil biology, and so on and so on. So this is why we talk a lot about traditional farmers, and I have studied mostly farmers in Latin America. That's where I'm from. You know, in the Andes, you will find farmers that have been farming for 5,000 years. And in the world, there's about 1.5 billion contadini, peasants. They conserve about 1.9 million varieties of crops, the diversity, genetic diversity. And they produce 70% of the food, depending on the country that you are. They control 20 to 30% of the land, but they produce 50 to 70% of the food. So the people that feed us are the family farmers, the small farmers, not the big farmers. Okay, that's something that needs to be, and this is not something that I invented. You go to FAO or statistics and it will show. And what these farmers have done for centuries is to mimic nature by diversifying their system. They don't have monocultures like in industrial agriculture. They have these very diverse polycultures, intercropping, agroforestry systems, and so on and so on. So basically, here are the two ways of farming. The one above is the industrial way, in which we go against the tendency of nature towards complexity. Because in nature, there's always a need to go towards complexity. So if you abandon a field, for example, a field, you abandon it, there's going to be a process of succession. That means it's going to, year by year, the community, the plant community is going to get more and more complex. That's the tendency towards complexity. So what we do in agriculture, in modern agriculture, is we create a wall, a chemical wall, against that tendency of nature. And we try to stop the insects and the weeds and the pathogens, spraying them constantly. In agroecology, what we say is instead of going against what nature does, why don't we accompany nature with agricultural systems that follow the logic of nature, that is diversity in time and space. So you create complex farming systems. So ecology has influenced agroecology a lot because, I mean, agroecology, ecology. And so if we're going to design an agriculture that is following what nature does, we need to understand this process very, very, very well. You see, succession, at the beginning, if you clear a field, there's going to be the colonization by certain species called pioneer, annual plants. And then after that, after a year, 2 years, then it's going to become more perennial, more shrubs are going to come in. And then a young forest will develop until you end up with a mature forest called the climax. Well, it turns out that the only way that the shrubs can colonize is by the forbs, the annual species, preparing the conditions for the next stage. So the forbs create the soil conditions and they create the microclimatic conditions in order for the shrubs to emerge, because the seeds are here. You see, the seeds of the forest are already here. Some of them will come with birds and things like that, but in general, all the seeds of the forest are here already in this stage. It's just that they don't germinate until the conditions are prepared by all these successional stages. When you look at the tendency of nature, you see that it doesn't maximize production. You see, in agriculture, we want to force ecosystems to maximize production. Well, it turns out when you look at the difference between gross production and respiration, that gives you primary net production, it becomes constant. It kind of plateaus. It doesn't go exponential like we want in agriculture. So this is very important to understand that in agroecology, we're not maximizing productivity. What we're doing is stabilizing productivity. Small farmers in Central America have learned about this. They didn't go to the university. They didn't get PhDs like us going there and telling them what to do. This is part of their observation of nature. And they start with maize and beans together, which Professor Rossi tells me his father tells him that in the hills here, farmers used to do corn and beans before. Then comes some species that are a little bit more perennial, like bananas, papayas, etc., and then ends up as a forest. So they plant the corn and beans. The seeds of the trees are already there, as I was telling you. Then some species of perennial, semi-perennial, like papayas, bananas, and things like that, start dominating. Then you create a system that is, storied. It has different structures, and then it's different strata. I'm sorry, and then you end up with a kind of a dominant mature forest. So it's kind of mimicking the succession of nature with agriculture. So I would say that half of the knowledge that we have in agroecology comes from studying the systems that were employed by small farmers in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and also in some parts of Europe, including Italy. So for example, this is a system called the milpa, which is very typical of Mesoamerica, where you grow corn, beans, and squash. And in these systems, when you study them from an ecological perspective, you have complexity below ground and complexity above ground, and there's a lot of interactions that you need to study here. Actually, there's hundreds of theses that have been done, master's thesis, PhD thesis on these systems. Some of them have concentrated in the below ground, some have concentrated on the above ground interactions, and the interactions between below ground and above ground, which are also linked. These are not separate. The system below the soil biologically is not separate from the above system, okay? There are a lot of complex interactions that they call above-below ground interactions. Below ground, there are many people that have studied, processes of facilitation, resource sharing, complementarity between the crops, depending on the root systems, depending on the species. For example, it is very common to intercrop legume with cereal. And we assume that the effect is that the legume fixes nitrogen, gives it to the cereal through mycorrhiza fungi, for example. But actually, some studies have shown that, for example, when you mix corn with fava beans, the fava beans release organic acids in the roots that acidify the rhizosphere so that the phosphorus that is made available is used by the corn. So that's a different interaction. Or when you look at the system of corn with peanuts, this was done in China. If you grow the two crops separate or you grow them mixed, something totally different happens with micronutrients. For example, the availability of zinc and iron and magnesium and copper is enhanced by the root exudates of both crops. If you grow one crop, it doesn't happen. You have to have both crops under. So an area that is very fascinating in agroecology today is to understand the root exudates. The more complex species you have, the more different roots you have, the more exudates, which actually exudate different compounds that stimulate different microbial communities. Well, a lot of studies have been done. I did a lot of research back in the 70s on intercropping and effects on pests. You can see that the pest population go down when you mix the crops because there are more beneficial insects present in the intercropping system than in the monocultures. Also, when you look at weed emergence, for example, this is a corn and bean association. You can see there's no weeds. But when you take the beans out, then the weeds come up because you're utilizing when you have the beans, you're utilizing the niche that the weeds would occupy. When you take the beans out, the weeds come up. So researchers, for example, have compared wheat biomass under monoculture versus polyculture, And you can see that the wheat biomass, for example, in a sorghum monoculture is 1.73 tons per hectare. But when you intercrop cowpea, which is a legume, with the sorghum, you reduce dramatically the wheat population and your yields go up. Okay? So the way to measure the productivity of these complex systems is through what is called the land equivalent ratio. Because what you're doing when you intercrop, you take two monocultures and you overlap them. Okay? So you have corn and beans separate here, and now you're going to put them together at the same time and the same space. So you have to use a formula that allows you to understand how effectively the resources are used in the soil. So for example here, you could conclude, oh no, the corn monoculture produces more corn than the intercrop, or the beans produce more in the monoculture. But what happens is that you need to use the formula in order to put the yield of the corn in polyculture over the yield of corn in monoculture plus the yield of the bean in intercropping versus the yield of corn in monoculture, and that will give you 1.5. That means you need 1.5 hectare of monoculture to get what you get from 1 hectare of polyculture. In other words, you need 50% more land under monoculture than when you're intercropping. Why? Because the intercropping, when you overlap the two systems, you're using more efficiently the water, the nutrients, the sun energy, and everything. A cut?
Yes, we stopped.
Oh, you stopped.
5 minutes.
You stopped 5 minutes. Okay. We stop.
Good afternoon. Very interesting. Thank you, Professor Altieri. I am very happy to hear this information that actually not in such a complete way, but I'm trying every year to pass on my ecology student. I teach ecology at university, and to the biological science and also to natural science students. And it's very interesting, but so the solution is completely to change our way to make agriculture. And actually, if corn is raised and then it is given to animals, this is is crazy. So we have completely to change our way, not only to cultivate, but also to feed. Our habits have to completely change, and I think this is the most difficult part, to change mentality. What do you think?
Yes, thank you, Professor Essa. Obviously, changing our mind and the mind of farmers and the minds of researchers is going to be, and politicians is going to be very important. I hope that we change our mind before the crisis becomes more severe. And I think that the crisis provide opportunities for change, and we need to take the advantage and to take the opportunity to make these changes now. And for that, I think that it's not going to be, the change is not going to come so much from professors like me or others saying that agroecology is the way, but it's to visit the farmers that are using agroecology and see how they are farming, how they are producing sustainably, how they're conserving our agrobiodiversity, how they are not emitting greenhouse gases, how they are producing food to feed the local population, and how they're doing it in a way that is environmentally sound and sustainable and resilient. So I think that the more we create and promote this, what we call agroecological lighthouses, these demonstration farms that are all over the world, I'm sure here in Italy also, is a key strategy to train farmers and to show farmers and the public in general about that this is possible, that this is not some utopia, but really is something that is happening and is needed, and that we need to scale up urgently.
Very urgently, yes. So the time is very short, and we have to act very, very quickly. I absolutely agree. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Anna. Someone else would like to ask something? Fiona White, Fabio Dell'Acqua, for example.
Yes.
Fabio is a
professor
teaching here. He's in engineering, and you will know him next year, second year. Please, Fabio.
No, I was actually, I had no specific question to ask. I followed the first part of his presentation very willingly. I was very much interested in the topic, and I'm very glad about the fact that we have hard facts here that support that biodiversity is not just a fashionable term, but it's something that can lead to increase productivity and to increase resilience of the whole system of food production. And we're talking about a basic resource for the survival of humanity. So it's not just how can I say, it's not just a detail, but it's something that is very important. So I would like to thank him for making this presentation, and also thank you for inviting him. He's very welcome. And if I have a chance, I would like to have maybe a chat with him in the next few days if he will be around, because I think that remote sensing, what we at the group of the remote sensing group here at the Department of Electrical, Computer and Biomedical Engineering do, myself and my colleagues, Professor Gamba, especially, what we do is we use satellite remote sensing, and I think
yes, Fabio, I would like to ask to Miguel, is a satellite and modern technician helpful for a new agronomy? This is one of the questions. Can help your technology for a new agroecological approach?
Yeah, well, the tendency worldwide in agriculture is not so much in the direction of agroecology. Actually, right now, they're talking about the new biotechnologies, CRISP. They're talking about the gene editing. They're talking about digital agriculture, robotics, the role of robotics. And all these technologies, you know, you could consider them neutral, but we need to understand what are going to be the impacts, the social impacts. For example, robotics, they change, you know, labor-saving technologies are going to displace hundreds of farm workers, and then what are we going to do with the farm workers? Digital agriculture, remote sensing can be very important tools in understanding the landscapes, the dynamics, and the complexity of landscapes, and to map fields. You can use that information to make agriculture more intensive in the use of chemicals, because then you can program how much each crop is going to receive, phosphorus or nitrogen or pesticides, or you can use that information to understand landscape ecology and so on and so on. So it depends on how you're going to use the technology. And then the other thing about big data is who is going to control the data? I mean, when you use drones and when you use your computer, the information ends up somewhere, you know. Somebody has access to your information. So my question, and a lot of people are raising this kind of ethical questions. Okay, these tools are important, but who is going to end up with that knowledge, with that information, and what are they going to use it for in the future? That's something that is an ethical question that needs discussion.
Yeah, sorry, Fabio would like to say something.
Yeah, sure.
Again, but after we have to close because he relaxed too much and now he has to
No,
go.
sure. Just thank you, Graziano. Just a very short note. I would like to point out that whereas most of the research in remote sensing for agriculture, much of current research in remote sensing for agriculture focuses on, as Professor said about how much of whatever substance we need to add, etc., etc. Comparatively little is being done to provide that information that he said is needed for a more sustainable form of agriculture. And I think we should aim there. I also think, I confess, I didn't think so much of the ethical concerns about how the information is used, but it's a topic that I would much like to deepen, maybe in a short discussion with it in the next few days. Thank you, and I cut here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Del Acqua.
Thank you.
Okay. Are you familiar with meta-analysis? Meta-analysis is a tool that is for you to search information, literature, thousands of papers, and then end up with that you give some parameters. You say, okay, I want to know about the effects of diversity on ecological processes in agriculture from 2000 to 2022, whatever, in Iraq or in the world or whatever. And then it will pull all the information out for you, and you will be able to review this literature and make a meta-analysis. So the meta-analysis that have been done on, for example, the effects of diversification strategies on different processes is all positive, actually. All the green means that there was a positive net effect. So you can see, for example, on soil fertility, on crop yield, on nutrient cycling, on biodiversity, on pollination, on pest control. Almost every aspect except the climate regulation, the tendency is a positive relationship between biodiversity in agriculture and processes such as soil fertility, pest control, pollination, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely, I mean, the literature is full of this information. And why is it that the farmers don't change then? Why do they want to continue with monoculture? Why do they want to continue with chemicals and so on and so on? It's a very complex matter. We can discuss it later. But there are economic reasons, there are psychological reasons, there are sociological reasons. There are many, many factors that influence farmers' decisions. So, to continue with this idea that we have learned a lot from small farmers. For example, in Central America and also in Colombia and in Brazil, farmers usually grow their coffee, the coffee that we drink, in forests. And for example, in certain parts of Mexico, you have 319 species of plants in the coffee system, okay? So the farmer, here's the farmer, you can see that there's the coffee, this little plant is coffee, the rest are all different types of plants. These farmers have to develop a very, they have to manage this complex system, so that requires a lot of knowledge. It's not the knowledge that we have, like following our Western way of understanding nature. They have their own way of understanding nature. They even have their own taxonomies. If you ask the farmer, how good is the soil? And the farmer goes, this is a very good soil. And then you go, wow, I study soils and they never taught me how to classify the soil with the sound or with the taste of the soil. Well, these are different indicators that not because, you see, as Western scientists, we have kind of discounted that knowledge. We say, no, that's ignorance. These people are primitive, they're ignorant. No, they have developed their own taxonomies. And so they have to manage these complex systems, when to prune, when to do this, when to harvest, and so on. And then from there, you harvest many, many products. One of them is coffee, but then many other things, mushrooms and fruits and so on and so on. And some of them go into international markets, some of them go to national markets, regional markets. Well, what's happening, unfortunately, this is in Spanish, but basically coffee systems, these traditional coffee systems, are becoming now more and more modified and transformed into monocultures. and because of the pressures of the market. There are certain varieties, modern varieties now of coffee that you can grow in the sun without shade, but they are very intensive in terms of use of pesticides and water and fertilizer. So what happens when you transform this system into this system, obviously you lose a lot of biodiversity, and then this system become dependent on fertilizer, because before the fertilizer was the organic matter produced by the trees. The trees fall, the leaves fall down, they decompose. That's the way the system is fertilized. Here you have to bring in fertilizer from the outside. And now with the cost of fertilizers, that's something that is actually challenging the farmers. But the worst thing is when the drought comes. You see, all the way in the tropics, there are periods of drought. So what happens is that here, obviously, you have much more evapotranspiration than here. Actually, this was measured, and I don't have the slide, but basically the evapotranspiration in this system is much higher. It's like 2 times more than in the system that has shade. So therefore, when you have a drought, these systems are much more susceptible to the climate change than the systems that are more diversified. Because of the importance of these systems, FAO created a program called the Globally Important Agricultural Heritage Systems. Actually, you can go to the website. They're called the GIA sites. It's like a category of UNESCO, just like you have churches, that are UNESCO patrimony. Well, these are agricultural patrimonies. And there are systems of remarkable landscapes with significant biological diversity. And the overall goal of the program was to conserve the biodiversity, but the knowledge also that allowed that biodiversity to prosper. So there's about 36 sites recognized by FAO in 15 countries. Some of them, for example, these are in the Maghreb, there's oases, in Tunisia. There's also in southern Chile, in China, in the Philippines, in Japan, in many, many countries. And these systems have several features. One of them, they have a proven history of sustainability. That means they have sustained production over millennia. So they have something that we need to learn from, resilience, diversity, etc. They have ingenuity. The farmers were able to co-evolve with natural ecosystems and develop a system of knowledge and appropriation of nature that makes sense with traditional practices and so on. Exceptional characteristics, a lot of diversity, genetic diversity, species diversity, landscape diversity, and they have global and local importance. Not only they are important for the local populations where the systems are, but they have global importance. So for example, one of the systems are the rice terraces in China, in certain parts of China, and also many other parts of Asia. And these systems are in terraces, as you can see there. And when there's water, they grow rice. When there's no water, there's rotation with other crops. You can see there's a lot of vegetation present here that is different kind of vegetation than rice. One component are the fish. Unfortunately, the picture didn't come out well, but they grow fish in the water, which is a source of protein. But these fish play a very important ecological function. They control weeds, and they also push the rice so that the leafhoppers, which are a pest, drop down and they eat it. So it play a role in biological control. Then they grow azolla, which is it's an association between a fern and an algae, fixes 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. 40% of that nitrogen is used by the rice. And then before the azolla suffocates the oxygen from the water and kills the fish, they bring in ducks. And the ducks eat the azolla, but they also produce manure, and they eat some snails, and so on and so on. So at the end, you end up with a system where you have different biodiversity components, fish, azolla, ducks, rice, in which the farmers have to assemble in a way that they're going to be interacting. And through their interactions, they promote the processes of biological control, of fertility management, of sustainable production and so on. So basically, this is what agroecology is. It's the art of integrating biodiversity components in an agricultural system that are going to be interacting with each other, and through the interactions, then they promote the changes that are needed, the processes that are needed, like nutrient cycling and biological control, and so on and so on. Well, I just wanted to show you very quickly some of the GIA sites. This is in the Peruvian Andes, in the Cusco region, where agriculture occurs in the mountains, and where farmers have classified the mountain, in different belts, and they grow a lot of diversity of potatoes. They don't have one variety; they have like 50 or 60 varieties. Sometimes they mix them together for genetic diversity and adaptation. And you can see that also they use the mountain. The farmers can have plots, fields, in different altitudinal gradients. That decreases the risk, because you can see here, if a family puts all the crops in one belt and there's a frost, then they lose everything. But as they increase the fields that they manage throughout the mountain, the risk goes down. In the same area, if you go up in the mountains and you get to the altiplano, which is called the top of the mountain at 3,500 meters above sea level, there were systems called the waru-warus. The waru-warus are systems of production of raised fields surrounded by water. And what happens is that this water comes from the Lake Titicaca, or can come from the rain. And here, the farmers have an effect on the microclimate, because the water absorbs the heat during the day and releases it at night. So when there is a frost, then the temperature increases in about 1 or 2 degrees, and the crop doesn't die from the frost. So this is a way of dealing with extreme weather. So here you can see that the production of these systems compared to the systems here in the hills, these systems will die from frost, and these potatoes will not, because of the protection from the microclimatic effect of the water body. Similar systems were created by indigenous people, but in the Mexican lowlands near Mexico City, called the Chinampa systems, where also raised fields surrounded by water canals. You can see here, this is during the times of the Aztecs. So these systems fed more than 2 million people in the city of, which is called now Mexico City. And the food was brought by in these canals. But these canals also play an important function, because there are certain weeds that grow here because of the eutrophication of the water, because of the residues from the city. But then they use it as a green manure and mulch in their fields. And they grow their crops, and they're able to produce all the food that they need for marketing and for their food security. So this is another example of another GIA site that is in Mexico today. This I already told you. But these systems are not limited to Latin America or Africa or Asia. These are, for example, some of the traditional systems in Portugal, where you grow it's called the enforzado, which is a system where you grow the grapes between the trees, and under you grow vegetables. This system is also a candidate for Aegeas. These are systems here in Italy, for example, olives with grapes and grass, where you can have sheep going around. This is another one that didn't come out well, but it's cherries with grapes. Or this is in Chile, beans with grapes. And these are the systems in the Canary Islands, where you grow these walls of stones in order to stop the wind that is salty. But at the same time, you are able to harvest water and concentrate the soil fertility around the plants of the vines. Okay, so these are systems that are adapted to drought and that there are systems that we can learn lessons from in order to develop the systems of the future. So, to end up here, agroecology is really hybrid science because it's affected by many other fields, and also there's a lot of other current alternative forms of agriculture that receive different names. For example, organic agriculture, agricolture biologica, permaculture, biodynamic, etc., etc. And all these types of agriculture have their own principles. But you can use agroecology, the principles of agroecology, and see if the systems are functioning under the agroecological principles. Because, for example, when we will see later, a lot of agricultura biologica, or organic agriculture, although they follow the principles of the creators of organic farming, there are input substitution monocultures. For example, you have grapes, that is a monoculture, but now it's biological. Why? Because you don't use chemicals, but you use biological products. Okay? But the structure of the system is the same. It's a monoculture. So you can go to an organic farm and basically say, look, what's happening here is that you can improve your system. You can follow the principles of organic, you can call it organic, but you can optimize it because you lack biodiversity, for example. You lack legumes to incorporate in the soil instead of bringing compost from the outside that you have to buy. You can use it here and improve, the soil fertility with local resources rather than resources from the outside. So, with that, I think I'm going to finish here, and I'm going to open for questions. The class is going to continue, obviously, for 5 more days, and we're going to talk about next time the role of biodiversity in agricultural systems. Then we're going to talk about how we can design biodiverse systems that are resilient to climate change, that are resilient to pests. And then we're going to talk about how we transition, how do we change the monocultures, large scale, small scale, doesn't matter, to systems that are based on agroecological principles. Okay? So we call that the conversion, the agroecological conversion. And I would like to encourage you to look at the papers that I send you so you have a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be talking about and discussing, so you can come more prepared for discussion and so on. So with that, I'd like to open up now for questions or comments or doubts, whatever you want. I like to make the class participatory because it's kind of boring for me to be talking 2 hours and don't get any feedback from you. So I would encourage you to ask questions. Yes?
Lorenzo, please come here. And Carly also later.
Yeah, I have one question about the previous chart about the meta-analysis chart, and why for you is that the differentiation practice makes even negative effect on climate regulation.
Yeah. Well, you see, I don't know about that study, but it depends on what do they define about climate regulation. Because first of all, the climate you cannot regulate. We cannot change the climate. So maybe what they're talking about is whether the system changed the microclimate. I don't know about that, whether they were referring to that or not. But in terms of resilience to climate change, the biodiverse systems are, if you do a meta-analysis on that, it will show that they're more adaptive, they're more resilient to climate change. So it's a good question because I didn't understand also climate regulation, what they were talking about. Are they talking about whether we're regulating the climate with agriculture or whether we are changing the microclimate with the intercropping or agroforestry? Obviously, when you intercrop and when you, as I show with the coffee systems, when you have a complex coffee system, you have less evapotranspiration. When you measure relative humidity, there's higher humidity in the complex system, there's less temperature in the complex system. So definitely changes the microclimate. And definitely, if a drought comes, the system that is more diverse survives more than the monoculture. So I don't know what they were talking about there in climate regulation, why it was negative or neutral effect. So I don't have an answer to your question, but it's a good question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, also because the canopy of the trees usually and helps to mitigate and to
Exactly.
prevent
Yeah,
warming
so-
condition. Yeah.
So maybe they were not referring to that.
Mhm.
They-
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
African here. We have also some questions from the public online.
Okay.
My question is, being a students of agriculture and we study pathology, entomology, genetics, and I feel the agroecology is more towards the primitive agriculture. What is the role of genetics in agroecology? Can we incorporate the gene and based on the climate? This is my
Okay.
question.
Okay.
Big question.
Okay. What I said is agroecology. It feeds from the Western science, genetics, entomology, plant pathology. Yes, we take into consideration that, but we also take the knowledge of traditional farmers. It's not primitive agriculture. The agricultura primitiva is the more industrial agriculture, not the traditional agriculture, in my opinion. So we're understanding how these farmers that were not influenced by Western science were able to develop systems that have stood the test of time. We're talking about 5,000 years or more that the systems still exist. If you go to the Andes, those waruwarus, those systems that I show you, they've been there for thousands of years. Modern agriculture has been around for 50 or 60 years and is already in trouble. Professor Graziano was telling me, we have drought, the systems their yields are going down. Yes, modern agriculture is in crisis and is not sustainable. That's why we want to talk about sustainable agriculture. Why? Because the systems are not sustainable. So, of course, we need to understand about entomology, plant pathology, and genetics, but we need to integrate them. Because, for example, when you study agronomy or any agricultural field, they will teach you entomology, one course, and then they will teach you another course on plant pathology, and they will teach you another course on soils, and so on and so on. And you will never understand the relationship between soil fertility and pest, for example, because you were not able to integrate all this knowledge. Because they teach you entomology, and then they teach you soil science, but in soil science they never mention that actually the management of the soil fertility can induce pests. If you have too much nitrogen in your soil, you can have more insect pests, more diseases, but that connection was never made. The same happens in medicine. In medicine, they teach you the parts, the heart, this, and you become specialized, in heart. And when you go to the doctor that knows about heart, and you tell him, hey, but I also have this stomach ache. Oh, no, you have to go to a gastroenterologist. I don't know anything about gastroenterology. Maybe there is a connection between the heart and the stomach, okay? But there's no integration in the knowledge. So what we're trying to do with agroecology is to integrate all this knowledge of genetics and so on, and at the same time the knowledge of farmers that have been doing it for thousands of years with a different code, different taxonomy. But that's what we're going to create. Now, of course, we're going to use the tools of genetics when it's necessary. But it turns out that the dominant view, the dominant paradigm in agronomy is to use new varieties, because that's the way that we're going to increase yields. That was the basis of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, you see what happens is that our thought, our system of thought in agriculture has been influenced mainly by 4 people, in my opinion. The first one was Descartes, who said, you cannot study the whole, you have to study by its parts. Okay? That's when the reductionism started in science. And we became specialized, compartmentalized knowledge. instead of integrating it. Then came Darwin, who said, well, he was misinterpreted, that the main force of evolution is competition, that the struggle of the survival, the survival of the fittest. And that mentality about competition dominates agronomy because we need to get rid of everything that competes with the crop. When in nature, actually, there's more cooperation than competition, much more cooperation. In the forest, you go in the forest that I show you, there's no competition. There's all kinds of proto-cooperations, mutualisms, all kinds of interactions that are happening. So we were trained that everything that is not the crop cannot exist anymore. We have to get rid of it. The third one was Malthus, who said, the reason why there's hunger, well, he did experiments with rats, but basically the Malthusian thought permeated agronomy and said the reason why there's hunger in the third world is because there's too many people and food production cannot catch up. And what we need to do is bring high-yielding varieties, modern varieties, through the Green Revolution to increase yields. That discourse still dominates when hunger, as I said, doesn't have anything to do with population. In the United States, there's 40 million people food insecure. It's not because there's no food, okay? And in Italy, I assure you that there's people that are food insecure also. And the fourth one was Liebig, who came up with the principle of the ¿cómo se dice in English?
Limiting factor?
Yeah, the limiting factor. Grazie, professoressa. Where there will always going to be a limiting factor, that is limiting production. And so he came up with this idea of the barrel of water, and the water is going to come out, where the limiting factor is. So what you need to do is overcome the limiting factor. And that's what agronomy became, overcoming the limiting factor constantly. Oh, nitrogen. Without understanding that the limiting factor is caused by other processes that are not working correctly. I mean, the fact that there's no nitrogen in the soil is because the biological processes, there's nitrification, denitrification, all kinds of bacterially mediated processes that make NO3 available to plants, okay? So that's what we need to understand. What are the root causes of that limiting factor? And so in order to answer, I hope I answer your question, but the point is that we can use improved varieties when it's proper, when it's appropriate, but it's not just genetics. You need to accompany all the management of that new germplasm with practices of diversification and so on in order to make the system sustainable. It's not just that a magic seed is going to solve the problem. You have to change the agricultural system and introduce that new seed, but at the same time change the management and the design of the system.
Thank you. We have other question, Cristiana.
Hi to everybody. Thank you. I want to thanks to be part of this very interesting meeting. And so thank you, Graziano Rossi and Professor Miguel Altieri. I surely understand that we have to change our mentality to be and to protect the world and the soil. I am in organic agriculture since 2020, so it's 20 years more or less that I produce organic rice, especially because I am in the south part of Milan, in Lomellina. It's an area in the province of Pavia that is the most important area of Italian rice. But we are very, very slow, few people that produce probably in a very sustainable way rice. I wanted to know if there are some experiences all over the world about the methods of the teacher. One of my teacher is Masanobu Fukuoka, and I suppose there are studies about the combination of 2 or 3 cultures in the same soil, as you explained before in your relation. And if clover, for example, is used to be in combination with rice field, in paddy field, also because in this period there is a very big problem in our area, in our region, about we don't have water to put in the paddy field. That's why I suppose it's possible try to make a new cultivation. I'm trying in these years. I fail, and I want to perseverance in these techniques. And what do you think about that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristian.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to know that there is a farmer in the audience, because you are facing real problems and real challenges, and you're also innovating. If you are facing drought, I would not recommend that you intercrop with a treble, with trifolium, with clover, because there would be too much demand for water, and at the same time the clover is also very aggressive, and it could compete with the rice, especially for water. So what our experience has been, on the one side, in the tropics, as I show you, the intercropping with fish and ducks. That's something that is very commonly done in Japan, in China, and other places. There are farmers also in California that use ducks in their fields, and the main approach for diversification of rice is, first of all, in rotation with other crops. For example, with Vicia, Vicia atropurpurea. In California, organic farmers do a rotation with legumes in order to replace the nitrogen, because rice is a highly extractive crop of nitrogen. So you need to replace it, and many farmers do that by intercropping doing rotation with Vicia, which is a technique of temporal diversification. The other approach is that the borders of the fields are diversified. So, for example, if you go to certain areas, especially again in the tropics, you will find that farmers in the mounds around the rice field, they will grow crops or vegetables or trees like bananas, vegetables, different crops, or even flowers to attract beneficial insects, but in the borders. I've seen also some farmers that do strip intercropping. That means in a rice field, you could have certain crops. For example, you could have 10 meters of rice and maybe 2 or 3 meters of another crop, and then 10 meters of rice and 2 or 3 meters of another crop intercropped. Not directly intercropped, but strips, fajas, fascia. Okay, so these are kind of ideas, and the only way to know if these things work is by doing it, by experimenting. As you know, as a farmer, I'm also a farmer now. I have my own little farm, and the only way to know if these things are going to work is by trying them and then evaluating, and that the performance of that new design that you will do.
Thank you very much.
Okay, grazie.
Obafemi, please.
Oh, hello. Perfect. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello. Have you a question?
All right. Thank you for the lesson. So I I want to ask you, food wastage. Do you think food wastage contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and wastage of natural resources? And how much damage can it cause to agriculture in the future, and how can it be avoided?
Capisce niente. Food waste?
Food waste is.
Yeah, food waste.
Greenhouse.
Yes, yes.
Huh?
The contribution of greenhouse gas. The wastage of
Yeah.
food is on the emission of greenhouse gas.
Yes. Well, first of all, just the production of food that then will go to waste causes emissions, say, because that food that is wasted had to be produced. So there are actually calculations, because today we know that on average, each person in Europe and the United States wastes about 115 kilos of food per year, throw away. If we can magically take that food and give it to Africa, for example, we would end with hunger in that region, but it cannot be possible. So in order to produce 115 kilos per person of food waste, you need to produce that food. And that food is produced industrially with nitrogen, fertilizer, with chemicals, with machinery, with irrigation. That produces greenhouse gases. So there are calculations that show that. And on top of that, after you waste that food, that waste has to be transported somewhere to a waste land, then disposed, then it's going to go through fermentation and decomposition. It's going to probably produce CO2. So yeah, obviously, food waste contributes to emissions of greenhouse gases.
Thomas Abeli from Roma.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Altieri, for your really illuminating talk. One picture of your presentation caught my attention, and was the one with the rice field covered with azolla. I want to ask a question about this practice, because this integrating system, especially with azolla, can be really interesting systems in terms of from an agroecological point of view. But for example, azolla is a very aggressive invasive species when it's taken outside its native range. So my question is whether this kind of consideration are done when these integrated systems are put in place. So if there is some consideration of the impact that these species have on the local biodiversity, and whether there is research ongoing to find local species that can be used in different parts of the world to provide the same ecosystem services of azolla in this case, or other species that usually provide ecosystem services.
Okay, yeah. Well, azolla in certain countries is already naturalized. I don't know in Italy, but
Yes, it is.
I mean, invasive species.
Not native.
Yeah, I mean, non-native. This debate between native and non-native is kind of relative, because there are plants that already exist in the environment. You're not going to get rid of them, so we better use them. Now, what impact can they have on the ecosystem and on other flora and so on? Obviously, that's something that needs to be looked at. But farmers that have been using azolla for hundreds of years, especially in Asian countries, they use them because because it has good effects. Otherwise, they would have discontinued the use of azolla. So whether it's azolla or another species that you can use here in Italy, that's something that needs to be tested. But definitely, azolla has the fantastic effect in flooded rice to fix nitrogen and to provide food for other organisms in the food chain. So I'm not familiar with another species that could play the same role. But again, as I said, if the resources exist, we need to use them. But of course, with the consideration that you're talking about, whether they have other effects on biodiversity or whatever, And if it does show negative effects, of course we should discontinue the use of that practice.
Okay, we have
Thank
now.
you.
Thank you, Thomas. We have now Valentina Vaglia. Valentina Vaglia, she is a teaching professor here for. Please, Valentina.
Hello. Hello.
What do you teach here?
Sustainable grass crops and sustainable management. So, and thank you so much, Professor Rossi and everybody for creating these moments. And thank you, Miguel Altieri. We met a long time ago when I was a student in different situations. And in particular, the last one was at the FAO Symposium of Agroecology in 219. And I remember nowadays your, what do you say to the, at the symposium? Because in Europe, agroecology have a different perspective from other countries. And I probably you remember or not, but I worked with Professor Bocchi, that he is from the University of Milan, and he is a professor of agronomy.
You worked with Milan.
Yes, I used the past. But sorry, my question is for everybody, I think, because I ask you to suggest European researcher or academic, what do you suggest to a researcher to enhance agroecology in our context? Because I know that our academy is very different from other. So I ask you if you have any suggestion for enhance agroecology in our courses.
Enhance agroecology? How to promote agroecology?
Yes.
Yeah.
In Europe.
In the academic context.
Where?
Well, the best way to promote agroecology, at least in Latin America, among farmers, has been farmer-to-farmer networks, where we have farmers that are more advanced in agroecology that teach other farmers how to use the principles of agroecology. That has been the main strategy. In academia, and in other circles, it has been more by creating, in Latin America, we created many years ago the Latin American Society of Agroecology, and you have a European Society of Agroecology, so that's a very important, and I just learned today that there's also a Society of Agroecology here in Italy that is meeting tomorrow in Rome. So there seems to be researchers and scientists and farmers getting together to discuss these matters, and that's one way to create more consciousness and a massive movement. But really, the other thing that is important is the consumers, because eating is a political and ecological act. Every time we eat and we consume food from the industrial food chain, as opposed to the small farmers in our region, then we are choosing a different path. So if we eat and support the small farmers of our region, we are creating socio-ecological resiliency in our communities. And as consumers, we cannot put all the weight of the change of agriculture in the farmers. The consumers, which are all of us that we eat 3 times a day, we need to create more consciousness about this. We need to support small farmers, local markets, and we also need to put pressure on the politicians in order to promote the policies that are necessary for agroecology to scale up. Because the reason why agroecology doesn't scale up is because there are no policies in place. There are not good markets that are open to everybody for the promotion of agroecology. So it is a complex task. It's not just the science of agroecology, understanding the systems. We need farmers to practice more, so the scaling up of agroecology among farmers, and we need the policies and the markets and the support of local governments so that this form of agriculture can be promoted even more, because industrial agriculture receives all the support. I mean, here in Italy and in Europe and in the United States, there's plenty of subsidies for industrial agriculture. We need to promote subsidies for, not subsidies, incentives for farmers to make the transition to agroecology. So we need more research, we need more extension, we need more policies, we need more markets, we need consumer awareness, so many things. It's very complex in order to scale up agroecology.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Valentina, have you something else to say?
Oh, thank you. Really.
Okay, now we are closing our first teaching of Miguel in Pavia University. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you from online and from. I have. Sorry. One more question. JP from India has a question, but come here. You have to come. Yes. If you would like.
Have a class. Yes, I'm sorry, Professor.
Okay.
I have to leave.
Sure. Ci vediamo domani.
No, inglese. I'm from Iran.
Tomorrow we'll see you.
See, yes.
2 or 11?
11.
11, okay.
See you.
Also, I will be here.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh-oh.
To check.
Yes. There's one more question.
Mike, it's not like a question, it's like maybe discussion topic.
Okay.
Okay. It's like now we are going back to previous time.
Back to the future.
Yeah, okay, but we are trying, like our grandfather, grandmother, whatever the technology they have used, we are trying to do right now to save our nature, pristines. And now, in my country, okay, in India, peoples are farmers, having lots of farmers. Production is more, land area is more, but the thing is, they are not thinking, maximum farmers not thinking about the save the nature. They are not thinking about the save the land. Because of what? They are thinking about the only productivity. They are thinking about the only market and getting the money. So what you suggest to like the get the knowledge about all the how to save the nature? Because see, I am the student, maybe I will become researcher in futures, or already you're working since more than 20 years. Everyone who is going to be researchers, they know. But some farmers, they are not qualified. They have some gap between communications. Yeah, you have told some farmers like they know already what is the like soil quality. Okay, some farmers maybe they are not too much like rich, they are very poor. They are thinking about the money only.
Okay.
So here is the industry, technology, or maybe upper is politics, or like farmers. So some communications gap is having, that's why maybe production is getting more, but land quality is going day by day, it's very bad.
Yeah, that's a good question. You see, what happens is that, well, in India especially, farmers and all over the world have become trapped in a model that was promoted by the universities and by the research station through extension. So, for example, if you look at the case of cotton in India, why there are so many suicides of farmers in India? It's because they got in debt. They got in so much debt that they couldn't afford it, and they had to commit suicide. We're talking about thousands of suicides. So these farmers that you're talking about, these poor farmers, that suddenly they sold them the idea of the Green Revolution, they are caught in a treadmill where they have to produce more because they have to cover the cost of the inputs, the seeds and the fertilizers and so they need to produce and produce more, and in addition to have some money for their families. Okay, so how do you break that cycle? And on top of that, they sell their product in a market that is totally biased against them, because usually they're intermediaries that come and buy what the farmer produce, and then they sell it in the market at a very expensive price. The farmers in Latin America, for example, the peasant, the contadini, they don't go to the market. There's an intermediaries that come, and then they take the food. So they get very little money. They are trapped, and they exploit nature because they have no other choice. I mean, if I was poor and I needed to produce food for my family, I would deforest. Obviously, I would cut the forest to produce food. They're caught. They're victims. They're victims of a system. So, how do we get out of that? That's where policies come in. For example, in Brazil, the local government, the government that would. Mr. Ahmad, close your microphone, please. Okay. So if you leave these farmers at the fate of the market, they will never get out of the cycle. So we need interventions. So for example, in Brazil is one of the only countries in the world that has a national law of agroecology. There's a law. Part of that law is that the government buys 30% of the food that is produced by the farmers. The government buys the food from the farmers so that food is served in the schools. Thousands of students that eat that food, okay? So these farmers are assured a market by the government, and therefore they don't have to go out there and compete, in a market that is totally biased against them. So these are the interventions that we need, in order to give viability. Imagine tomorrow we declare a law here in Pavia that says all the food that the schools, the university, your cafeteria here, the schools, the lunches, the hospitals, all the food has to come from the small farmers in the region. That would give an incredible economic incentive for these farmers to start producing food, usually, hopefully in an agroecological way, which in turn would have a huge impact on the health of the people, because you start feeding children healthy food, diverse food, like fruits and vegetables and things like that, all produced agroecological instead of, pasta and pizza and hamburgers and whatever they give them in school. That would have a huge impact on the health of people. So what I'm trying to tell you is that these farmers that you're talking about, I don't know in India, but I know in other countries, are victims of a system. Mm-hmm. And the only way to break out of that is not by leaving them at the fate of the market. It's by intervention from policies that are going to be pro-poor. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's one idea. We can continue talking about.
But it's very difficult. Something like, I feel like that it's very, suppose you made it policy, I made it policy, maybe someone made it policy. Maybe its policies maybe start between the rooms. It's not going outside to the practical fields, or maybe the not connectivity with the farmers.
Okay, so that's why the other tool is farmer-to-farmer networks. Mm-hmm. You have to have, in order for that to happen, for those farmers to change, you have to have a social organization present. And also you have to have farmers leaders that are going to help those farmers. And in India, there's a huge movement called Zero Budget. Are you familiar with Zero Budget? Mm-hmm. It's a huge movement of farmers that don't use inputs, but that's why it's called zero farming, zero budget farming. And I understand there are thousands of farmers on that. But for that, they needed to organize, and they needed leadership, and they needed a methodology. So if you don't organize the farmers, they're never gonna break out of the cycle of poverty. It's not that the technology is gonna do magic. You have to have a social milieu, a social organization under which these changes are gonna happen.
And one more, already you have told about it's so many questions arise about the artificial intelligence, or maybe digitalized, or maybe robotics, something like that. Okay. It's like my thinking, like already we have faced lots of problems after using the technology. Okay, now again, if you use this type of technology, then again problems can be created after 20 years, 30 years, or maybe 50 years. Then what's your like point of view? What do you think it?
Well, as I told you, we cannot solve the crisis with the same tools that created it. So these people that are creating the new technologies are the same people that created the old technologies, or they are following the same path. It's just that there's more sophistication, more control, and I think that there is going to be side effects that we cannot anticipate right now, but that there are going to be side effects. Can you imagine, for example, it's already at the border of being marketed already robotic pollinators. So we killed all the bees with pesticides, so now we're going to put pollinators that are robotics. Okay, what are the impacts of that technology in the environment? Nobody can anticipate, but obviously we should take a precautionary principle and assume that there are going to be consequences and there are going to be side effects that we have no idea what they're going to be. But nobody's thinking about that because everything is the market, driven by the market.
Yes.
So that's a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's very clear.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a quick question.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, we saw that some species like cannabis, nowadays we know that it's one of the most productive species, no? But
More profitable.
Profitable, yeah. Why, in your opinion, is the least used on the market, or in European market, or research field?
Well, in California, it was legalized. In many countries, has been legalized, and that's why the market exploded. And unfortunately, what's happening is that the market now is being controlled by certain companies, only a few companies, because cannabis in California was grown by small farmers illegally inside the forest in Northern California. Well, those people that started promoting cannabis when it's illegal now are out of the market. Now the main actors are big companies like Marlboro that produces cigarette is a big producer of marijuana, because now marijuana, when it's legalized, first of all, there's all kinds of rules and taxes and fees that you have to pay. So that leaves out all the small producers, and the big ones are now the ones that are. And then it's grown under very sophisticated greenhouses in the desert of California, and in massive greenhouses with light and temperature and humidity. Who can afford that? So this is what happens with this technology. So it's very profitable, but the profit goes to a few, not to everybody.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your brilliant lecture. Well, the last autumn, we were discussing the role of the side areas close to the cultivated areas. So, as you know, some authors in literature suggested to restore at a certain extent the complexity of plant communities and natural communities just in the side areas. And this may be useful, according to these authors, also to reduce the populations of vectors, of disease vectors. You are an entomologist. What do you think about this?
Well, actually, Professor Nichols is expert in that field. So when she gives a lecture on the role of biodiversity in pest control, vector control, etc., you will see that it's not only the diversity within the field, but also the diversity of the surrounding fields, what we call the matrix, the landscape matrix. So you can have forests around the field. That forest can have an effect inside the field. So that we're going to talk about that in the class.
I don't know whether I will be there because I'm a researcher, I'm no longer a student. However, I'm sure it will be brilliant too.
And actually, there's a book that we published with the Society of Italian Entomology Society or something. Academy, the Entomology Academy Italiana de Entomologia, that is about that field, biodiversity and pests and insect pests. Okay? Well, I'm going to discount 15 minutes from next week. No. I don't know, Professor Rossi. Siamo finito o what?
No, the last.
Okay. Ok. Grazie a tutti.